All right, Nick, I'm going to be honest for a second. We've done about 70 episodes on this great show. We've had luminaries, American historians, professors like our buddy Michael Eric Dyson, New York Times bestselling authors, correspondents across the news landscape. I got a little secret for everybody. I don't care about any of those episodes because I have not been as excited to talk to the host and the producer of the #1 podcast in America, American Radical, the story who killed Roseanne Boyland, is the host of American Radical and Ayman on the weekend nights on MSNBC, Ayman Mohyeldin, and the producer of this amazing podcast. I tip my hat. I told you this off air, Preeti, as one producer to another. Preeti Varathan, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast and being with us today.
Thank you, guys.
Listen, I want to get into this because this series really captivated me. And I was telling both of you guys this off air about, my family going through this. We're going to get into that in a second. But Ayman, I turn to you for a second because January 6th has become so polarizing as a topic in this country. We know why. There's one faction of a political party that is saying that it was FBI crisis actors, et cetera, et cetera. But we should all be on one side of this, right? Breaking into government buildings, bad, right? Shouting, hang Mike Pence, bad, right? Your series really goes into how one person, and to be honest, probably more people, get down rabbit holes of conspiracy theories, et cetera. And then all of a sudden they find themselves on January 6th. Can you take our audience into the series? What attracted you? I know the personal relationship you have with Roseanne's brother-in-law and Preeti as well. Like what got you guys to saying we could do a whole series about this?
Yeah, I mean, well, thank you very much for having us. And we're honored to be here with you guys and speaking about this because it's such an important conversation. And thank you so much for giving the podcast a shout out. The story began because we all lived through January 6th. And I think that day we all watched in horror how close our democracy came to being essentially, at the very least disrupted, in a worst case scenario, overturned. Because if the election would have been overturned, if something would have happened that would have stopped that process from being fulfilled, we could have been in a very different reality. So I think the gravity and the severity of the moment was not lost on anybody who witnessed it that day. And as we now see, even from the January 6th Commission, Republicans themselves, even Fox News hosts, realized how serious this moment was. What I didn't realize was the personal connection, and that wouldn't come until a few days later. But even with the personal connection, I think the message that my friend Justin Cave sent me saying the family believes that she was radicalized and used that exact word, and also saying that it happened in the span of 6 months, really was an alarm bell for me because I knew that town, I knew the community of Kennesaw. And for me, it was a bit of a disconnect from what I had grown up in, the community that I had grown up in. And hearing that word radicalized was something I had seen overseas in my years as a foreign correspondent covering terrorist attacks in Europe and in the Middle East. I just never imagined that I would be hearing it in the context of Kennesaw, Georgia, and the hometown that I went to. So it immediately, as a journalist, it piqued my interest. I connected with Justin. I began to learn more about the story and why the family felt that she had been radicalized. And in the process of doing so, I felt like there was something here that we as a society could learn from this one family's experience. And that was part of the reason why I immediately reached out to my colleagues at NBC and see if we can find a way to tell this story. And so that's how it began. That's the genesis of it.
Ayman, Preeti, it's hard for me to ignore, Ayman, as you use the word radical, which is actually what drew me to the podcast when Mike had put it in front of me. Like you all, and just full fact here, the four of us in this conversation are all people of color. We hear the word radical or radicalization. We think of a process that typically refers to fundamentalist or extreme Islamic terrorism. That's usually sort of what we hang our hats on in the United States with that term. It was interesting to hear that term as related to a white person and an organization through QAnon that essentially is predominantly made up of white people. Over the course of developing this podcast, the interviews you both have done, and just a lot of the learnings you've taken, what did you find to be, and Ayman, specifically just with your background in international correspondence, where did you see sort of the trends and similarities between the process that Roseanne had gone through as it relates to what we've seen overseas, oftentimes when we've used the word radical or the process of radicalization?
Yeah, and it's something that a lot of my friends and certainly a lot of my Muslim friends pointed out, and it's not to make light of the situation, but to the point that you are describing, the irony of a Muslim man in America talking about radicalism in the context of a white middle class woman in this country is not lost on a lot of people who over the last, as you just said, over the last 20 years have come to understand radicalism only in the context of extremist terrorist attacks overseas and the so-called war on terror. And so for them, the framing now was being, kind of flipped upside down, which is like, wait a minute, how can radicalism happen to people that are not the way that we have been told radicalism only exists, which is among a certain religion, committed in a certain type of context or in a certain type of framing. So, for me, and Preeti is known about this because I've talked about it a lot, and it was one of the central tenets of the podcast. I had seen a lot of similarities with the radicalism that I had covered overseas, which is that there generally is kind of like a little bit of a triangle of where Roseanne and the profiles of people that I've seen in the past really genuinely fit in, which was there are people who have suffered, meaning they have been down on their luck. They've had some problems, perhaps either personal tragedies that they had to overcome or challenges that they had to overcome. And that puts them in a position of disadvantage. There is disinformation that they're constantly being bombarded with, that they're subject to. And then there is this element of demagoguery. And when you see that in the context of overseas, the demagogues, the people who would say to these destitute people or the people that are down on their luck, hey, follow me, let's go and fix this. We can solve the problems and all of the ills of your society by attacking Americans, by killing the infidels, by blowing up, whatever we needed to. And so when they can get people warped into that mentality, these demagogues can exploit the vulnerability of certain people and get them to follow the disinformation they put out there. And so in the context of Roseanne in the United States, the disinformation was there, as we explored in the podcast. Roseanne was somebody who struggled with personal addiction and had all kinds of personal challenges in her life at some point. And so it made her vulnerable to conspiracy theories and disinformation. And what was new, I think, in this particular context was Donald Trump, who for the most part functioned as a demagogue for these people. He exploited their vulnerabilities and said to them, if you follow me and do what I tell you, we can fix the society's ills. We can save our democracy. We can save the children, part of the conspiracy theory that they believed in. And so that was a bit of a similarity in the pattern that I saw between what I did overseas and what I did on this story with Preeti.
Preeti, I want you to chime in here because, I mentioned to you, obviously, I was a producer in news and sports. And so some of the research that you did, some of the interviews that you did, what's a key takeaway you want the audience to take away from this, not only the podcast itself, but the entire story of Roseanne and her family, not really understanding where she, veered to over the last 12 months?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think the biggest takeaway and part of why Ayman approached our team and part of why I was so interested in his pitch and his story. And he said, hey, I have this friend from high school. He sent me a Facebook message. Take a look at this Facebook message, just because it's not just the word radicalized, which was really interesting to us, but the time span, right? That this thing can happen really fast. And so for me, and I think it's sort of working because, I try not to read the comments too much, but I definitely read the comments for the podcast. I think people are recognizing that this thing can happen quickly. It can happen subtly, and it can happen in ways that you wouldn't expect, like Roseanne sort of fell down her own rabbit hole and became radicalized within a span of essentially 6 months. And so for me, I think if people can kind of recognize that this thing is more like ubiquitous than we realize, and that it can happen pretty quickly, I feel like the podcast will sort of have succeeded in that sense. Because that's just, I came to this story, understanding Ayman's background, understanding what happened, but really with a pretty open mind, right? I was like, I'm just going to talk to as many people in Roseanne's life as I possibly can. And that's the thing I kept pulling away, that they were so shocked by the difference, that they never saw it coming, that, a lot of them like breathlessly wanted to tell me about what she was like in March of 2020. This is what Roseanne Boyland was like. And by August of 2020, she was a completely different person. And so I think, that's that's the thing that I really have taken away from this. Like, I spend a little bit more time, even in my own life, thinking about that uncle I'd never message, because I'm like, they just have crazy ideas and I'm not going to talk to them. Instead of trying to like fully alienate them in my brain, I now am like, maybe that one Facebook post they posted is a little bit more dangerous than I thought, and I should reach out and communicate with them and see what's going on. And so for me, like, that's the real big thing I pulled away from all of this, is that it's not literally everywhere, but it's much more common than you realize, and that it can happen very, very quickly.
To that end, what do you as you both have gone through this journey, really, as journalists and storytellers, if you both were talking to someone who had a concern that a member of their family may be going down a similar rabbit hole, what are some signs that, in just the reporting you've done, just things you were observing as you've gone through this, that you would share with someone as things to pay attention to and look out for?
I think, look, these things are complicated, right? And I feel like that there are a lot of like legitimate experts who are dedicating their lives, whether they are psychologists or therapists, who are trying to understand radicalization and rabbit holes. And they are the primary people I would sort of direct someone's attention to, right? There are a lot of like legitimate resources from people who have doctorates in this thing who are spending time on this. But from sort of what we learned, it's a lot of it is sort of about just paying attention to the thing that a person is saying and like asking them why they think that, right? It's like, what is your information source? Where are you getting that from? Was it from a New York Times article, or was it from, a YouTube video? And really sort of like pushing back on the narratives that people are building. Because one of the takeaways I had personally is that a lot of this sort of grows in isolation. One story we kind of track in this piece is about how, like, as Roseanne fell deeper and deeper into a rabbit hole, her family couldn't totally identify with her, and they didn't really know whether to be hyper supportive or not be supportive, or to like sort of aggressively question her or not. And as they were figuring that out for themselves, she found community in other places, right? It's like, no matter what people are believing, they're going to sort of go seek community. And I think a lot of it is about challenging people's information channels, because this is in many ways what this kind of comes down to, right? It's like, where do you get your information? Where do you get your news? Is it at 2 a.m. on a YouTube video from a person who is not accredited, but is like saying something really poetic? Or is it, from an accredited news source where you can say, yeah, like this scientist from the CDC said XYZ thing? And so that's personally one of my biggest takeaways, is just really asking people, like, not being afraid to say, okay, that's an interesting idea. Where did it come from? I think that's really important.